In this video, we're going to cover Spring REST API design. For REST API design, when building a real-time project, we need to wonder who will use our API. Also, we need to be aware of how they will use our API. And then we need to design the API based on the requirements. All right, let's go ahead and look at the API design process. The first step is reviewing the API requirements. Then we'll go through and identify the main resource or entity, and then from there we'll use the HTTP methods to assign the action on a given resource. Now let's start with step 1 of reviewing the API requirements. And here's an email that we received from the boss, and it says, create a REST API for our employee directory system. Okay. Basically, what we'd like to do is allow the REST clients to get a list of employees. They can also get an employee by ID, and then they can add a new employee and also update an employee. And finally, they can delete an employee. Effectively, we want to have full CRUD support here via our REST API. In step 2, we need to identify the main resource or the main entity. What we want to do is look for the most prominent noun in the requirements document. For our project, the most prominent noun is employee because we saw that over and over again during those requirements. The convention is to make use of a plural form of the resource or entity. Here, we'd have employees. And for our endpoint, we'd have /API/employees. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule, but this is the general convention that's used in REST API design. Moving ahead to step 3, we need to use the HTTP methods to assign an action on a resource. Here, for a given post method, we'll use that for creating a new entity. And then for a get method, we'll use that to read a list of entities or a single entity. Then we'll use the put method to actually update an existing entity. And then we'll also use the delete method to delete an existing entity. Effectively here, we'll have full CRUD support by specifying the appropriate HTTP method in our operation. And this is the actual best practice that's used for real-time projects. Okay, let's take a look at some CRUD endpoint examples for our application. We can use the post method and we'll send it to /API/employees, and this will actually create a new employee. We can also use the get method and send it to the same endpoint, and we can use that to read a list of employees. We can also use the get method and send it to /employees/employee ID in curly brace. That's the path variable or path parameter, and we'll use that to read a single employee by ID. We can use the put method to actually update an existing employee, and we can use the delete method to actually delete an employee by going to /employees/employee ID in curly brace. Now for post and put, we'll need to send over the employee data, and we can send it over as JSON in the actual request message body. And we'll see examples of that later on in the course, and also when we actually run our application. When we run our app, we'll make use of Postman and we'll provide that employee data as JSON for handling the post and the put. Now let's talk about some anti-patterns. Don't do this, okay, because these are REST anti-patterns. They're considered bad practice. When you actually list out your endpoints, don't include the actions in the endpoint. For example, don't say employees list or delete employee, add employee, or update employee. That's not the best practice here. Instead, you should use the HTTP methods to assign the actions. All right, so the big thing here is don't include the actions of verbs in the actual endpoint. Use the HTTP methods instead, so make use of the get, put, post, and the delete. And also just kind of a recap or refresher, for our given application, we're going to have CRUD support, and we're assigning the actions here based on the appropriate HTTP methods. And notice here how our endpoints, we simply have the entity name or the resource name. We don't place any behavior in the actual endpoint itself. We pass that behavior over or action using the appropriate HTTP method. And then kind of to pull this all together, we'll have an employee service, we'll make use of Spring REST, and we'll have full CRUD support for our backend database.
Okay, now let's take a look at some other API examples. And so these are some API examples from other real-time projects, just so you can see how they've designed their APIs, and also just to see the similarities between what we've created and also what other larger companies are creating. So we'll take a look at the APIs for PayPal, GitHub, and also Salesforce. PayPal provides an invoicing API, and you can get full details on this API at the link here on the slide. Using their API, you can perform CRUD operations on invoices. So here, to create an invoice, we simply use a post. To retrieve or list invoices, we use a get. And also to show a specific invoice, we do a get, and we pass in that invoice ID as a path parameter. And then to update an invoice, we make use of the put method, and we again pass over that invoice ID. And then finally, to delete an invoice, we simply use the delete method, and then we pass over the given invoice ID as a path variable. And that's basically it. So this follows what we've seen in some of our previous examples for our CRM application. Now let's take a look at GitHub. They provide a GitHub repositories API. You can get full details at the link here. And then using their API, you can create a new repository by simply using a post method to this given endpoint /user/repos. You can delete a repository by going to repos/owner/repo. Now the :owner and the :repo, that's the same thing as putting curly braces around those items. So effectively, it's a path parameter or a path variable that you can send in when you actually submit that request. Also, you can list repositories by simply doing a get on /user/repos. And then finally, you can get a specific repository by doing a get on repos :owner :repo. And then finally, we can take a look at the Salesforce REST API. So Salesforce has a large number of APIs, and we'll take a look at one of them here, the industry's REST API. And this matches up very nicely with our CRM application because these are kind of in the same space. You can get details on this REST API at this link here. And then basically they give you different endpoints. So one, to retrieve all individuals, you simply do a get on this /individual. To retrieve one individual, you do a get on individual / that individual ID. To create an individual, we use a post. And then to do an update, we use a put. And again, basic format. Now, one thing that's slightly different here with the Salesforce API is that they didn't use the plural form of their entity or their resource. Instead of individuals, they simply called it individual singular. And that's fine. It's a small minor thing. As I mentioned earlier, the convention is to use plural, but there's no hard requirement to do that. So different APIs will do things slightly different. But overall here, this kind of follows the same pattern and the same process that we've seen so far with REST APIs. And this is pretty cool.